I bet you thought that Indiana Jones as a franchise was done. Surely after the most recent Dial of Destiny, they could never bring back the archaeologist going around the world, sashaying into adventures and finding the greatest historical artifacts. Well, folks, Indy is not yet an artifact either, and we've got a rumor, a scoop that says Lucasfilm is getting ready to revive him, only this time, we're kind of actually excited about it. Hello folks, happy day, and welcome back to the Pro Channel. We are coming to you from somewhere sunny, USA. The studio is glistening, and so is Lorne, because you're listening. No, that's not sweat, that is magnificence, folks. Magnificence exuding right from Lorne Connor. Welcome back, sir. How are you?
I'm apparently glistening. I'm happy to be here.
As they say in Spanish, I think you're brillante, but no, that doesn't mean brilliant. Well, it sort of does. Anyway, Lauren, we've got a fun topic today, and we're so happy everybody is joining us. By the way, folks, quick update on Disney World, Universal Studios, and the rest over there with the hurricane. Yesterday, we talked about some of the damage that we were hearing about, and that continues to be minor. We're talking about shingles have been taken off of the Grand Floridian in some places. There's some siding that's missing, but overall, everything's going to be opening back up today, later today, and you can get back under your way having a good time on the vacation. Folks, don't forget the victims of the hurricane. Many folks out there in south of the Tampa Bay area, as well as people in Western North Carolina, are suffering through the weather impacts, and we hope that you will consider giving to appropriate charities to help them out, or lending a helping hand if you're so fortunate to be able to do so. All right, let's dive in, folks. As we do, click the like button. Lauren, today we're talking about a happy topic, perhaps. Before we do, and by the way, folks, Lauren has no idea what we're going to be talking about, so he did not have a chance to listen to the intro that you heard. Here it is, Lauren. Here's a hint, I suppose. I'll just say that as we get ready to talk about Indiana Jones and what Lucasfilm might be up to, I was perusing to make sure that no one else had been talking about this. And just in the off chance that this website here had some sort of inkling of what's going on, we're going to give them some credit. This is out of Sci Fi Pulse. It's back from August. It says, rebooting Indiana Jones, a fresh approach to the young Indiana Jones Chronicles and a sequel series, okay? This is by Richard Strike. I don't think, having read this, that Richard Strike had the scoop that we have. But just in case Richard had heard something, I want to give credit where credit is due, okay? All right, so folks, check out that article. It's down in the link to the video description down below the video. Okay. All right, Lauren, here's what we're hearing from our source. And again, folks, we're talking about something that is way off in the future. It is, therefore, a future work product, is not out in the public yet, and that means everything here is rumor and speculation. That said, Lauren, I have a source who has been right in the past and tells me that it appears Lucasfilm is doing some developing, shall we say, maybe some preliminary work on what it would look like to do a young Indiana Jones movie in which Indy would be around the age of 14, would clearly not be played by Harrison Ford, and they may believe that's young enough that it wouldn't be a problem for the character to not be played by Harrison Ford. I suspect, Lorne, that what they're looking at is, what if they adapted the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which was a television series, I believe, back in the 90s, or what if they set out on their own? And so I'm curious, Lauren, you're hearing this for the very first time. I'll add this too, okay? So let's throw this curveball into the mix. I'm told that this would be also something that they're looking at for a post-Kathleen Kennedy era at Lucasfilm. I don't know when that would happen. Kathleen, though, is 71 years old. One would presume an Indiana Jones movie is 3, 4, 5 years away. If they do this, it makes sense that would be in a post-Kathleen Kennedy era. I don't think that is groundbreaking or earth-shattering or anything like that. But, Lauren, where would they go with a movie if they did choose to do a young Indy Chronicles movie? Would they pick up the story where it was? Would they fill in gaps? Or should they start completely anew?
That's kind of an interesting question, because that was what I was thinking when you mentioned that they were taking off from Young Indy, because the Young Indy series followed Indy at a couple different phases of his life. There was his very young years when he was 9 years old, played by Corey Carrier. And then they jumped ahead to the war years, which was World War One. And he was played there by Sean Patrick Flannery. And that was involving all of the war in Europe. And then there was a little bit of the post-war years after the war was over and he came back to the United States. So they have a window of opportunity there. If you're talking about 14 years old, that would be between the period when Corey Carrier was playing him at 9 and when Sean Patrick Flannery picks up when he's about 20. If he's 14, then you're talking about 1913. And I'm trying to think of what would have been going on at that time that they could adapt. What's kind of interesting.
You may now be doing the homework of Lucasfilm, Lauren. They may be watching right now saying, okay, what's he got? That's what we're going with. I
mean, what's kind of interesting about this period, and I could actually tie this a little bit into some of the stuff that they did in the post-war years, is this is an interesting period in American history because you're pre-roaring 20s, but you're post-Wild West. And there was kind of this transitional period that was going on where the United States was being electrified. You had obviously the Transcontinental Railroad had been put in. It was a cosmopolitan time when everything was thoroughly modern. Obviously not to our standards, but at the time, the world was going through kind of a revolution, and it was a very optimistic time. At the same time, you still had elements of the Old West that were there. And the way that I would maybe tie that into one of the storylines of the Young Indy series, and one of my favorites, was when Indy was in Hollywood. One of the things that the Young Indy series did, and what George Lucas was trying to do, was get kids interested in history. And every one of the episodes, he was usually meeting with a historical figure that was usually in about the right place and the right time for where that historical figure would have been, to add a historical element to it. And in the Young Indy series, for a little bit, Young Indy was working some of the Hollywood backlots as a studio page. And he ended up encountering Wyatt Earp, who was acting as a consultant on Westerns at the time, which is actually true history. And so, being as you're in that time period, I could see you doing some kind of a hybrid of maybe a Western and a traditional Indy story. That's maybe the direction I would take it if I were looking at it. 14 years old, I feel like in a way that's a little bit young, but if you want to try and integrate this into the already existing canon, that's the way you do it. Otherwise, you're going to have to do a reboot.
And let's talk about the wisdom of this, Lauren. So I can tell you what the source tells me in terms of why they're looking at this, and it has to do with relevancy. So they have theme park attractions, rides, and all of that, and they need Indiana Jones to still be something that's viable as a franchise. It's also a major property for Lucasfilm, but it also was a major failure. They need to revivify the franchise. They need to have it be something that's relevant to society and to culture. Well, how do you do that? And one way you could do that is you could start at the beginning, tell a tale that's not been told before, and do it with someone who nobody's going to complain that, oh, well, it's not Harrison Ford. Well, clearly it's not. He's 14, and 82, 83, 84, 85-year-old Harrison is not going to do the voiceover for a digital version of 14-year-old him. So this is a way for them to get around it. But the question, Lauren, is it wise? Do you think that they should be attempting to keep Indy going? And if so, is this the way to do it?
There's two ways I could answer the question, and that is that I'm always going to want more Indy. I think Indy is a very important character. I'm just as big a fan of Indiana Jones as I am of Star Wars. I just talk about Star Wars more. Indy is important for a different reason, and it's because of the historical aspect. When I was in school, history was my worst subject, and a lot of it was because of the way that they were trying to teach history to me in school, until I got a particular instructor who approached it from a different angle and made it make sense to me. And from that point on, history became a fascinating subject to me. And Indy is a way to approach that. I think the Young Indy Chronicles was not as successful because they leaned into the educational aspect a little bit too much for the audience that wanted to see the show. It was a passion project for George, but it wasn't the Indy that you see in the movies. but I think that it still serves that purpose of being an entry point for people to gain an interest in history. And I think that's a really important thing. What makes doing indie tough is that if you're going to do indie right, there has to be a supernatural element, and there has to be exotic locations, exotic cultures. And today, that's considered cultural appropriation, or perhaps a little bit of Orientalism, is what they used to call it. And I think that people are so easily offended these days that they forget these things did spring out of the pulps. And that's what gave them that adventure element. In the days of the pulps, you didn't have people able to travel like they could today. So they could only learn about locations that would have been exotic to them through travelogues or hearing from people who had been to these locations and recounting the tales and stories that they'd heard.
Now, Lauren, let me pause for just a moment. You and I know what you mean when you say pulp, P-U-L-P,
Mhm.
but for some viewers out there, they may wonder, well, what is this he's describing? So could you explain to the audience when you say pulps, what that is exactly?
Sure. It's when you're thinking of the classic early 20th century adventure swashbuckling stories, lots of those were printed in periodicals and magazines that were on really cheap paper that was basically pulp. And many times these stories were serialized. This is actually where you get the movie Cliffhanger from. And authors were paid for these short stories by the story and oftentimes by the word count. And the way that they hooked you and brought you back into buying the next issue was having all of these cliffhangers in the stories. And oftentimes, the really popular stories would later be collected into volumes as a novel or book, which was also printed on pulp paper. So when you hear
Hold
about,
on just a second, Lauren. Let me explain this to some people, because I love this discussion. There's a lot of people out there learning a lot right now. What you're saying is that the reason we use the term cliffhanger, because the nomenclature that is today, is because oftentimes the heroes in these stories were literally hanging from a cliff. So those were the cliffhangers. You had to get the next issue to find out, did they live? Did they survive? Did they pull themselves up? Did they fall into the water below, and what happened? And the idea that you have cliffhangers in pulp fiction comes from the fact that it's fiction written on the very cheapest form of paper, which is literally pulp. And that's where we get these terms. And Indiana Jones is an homage, the original Indy, although we think of it as a classic. It actually is looking back from its point of time to the classics from the 20s, which were pulp fiction filled with cliffhangers. Folks, is
yeah,
this not wonderful?
and Indy was, he's definitely a representation of the old Republic serials, and they did this all the time. Um, a major inspiration for Indy was a Charlton Heston film, and the name of it escapes me at the moment. But if you remember Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the big creepy crawly in that one was Siafu ants that just uh, uh, decimate the jungle around them as they move through in these giant waves. These are real creatures, but they were heavily featured in that Charlton Heston movie. And in fact, that's where the bomber jacket and the fedora comes from, is he wore that character, or he wore that costume in that movie. And
Wait a minute. You're telling me it doesn't come from an adventure on a train with a lion?
sadly, no. It's
Oh,
but I mean, this was the stuff that George and Stephen were steeped in as kids. They loved this stuff, and so they were taking what they remembered from going to their Saturday morning cereals and distilling it down into what eventually became Indiana Jones.
and by serials, he means the issues that came out often, not the Lucky Charms. All right, Lauren. So let's talk about the pulp fiction of this then. And I've been thinking about it. I actually have some optimism. I actually have some real optimism for this, because it's not going to be, I believe, under the direction of Dave Filoni, because I don't think he has as much interest in this as he does Star Wars. Now, he's the creative lead at Lucasfilm, but I'm hopeful this might actually get out a little bit into maybe some third parties. And maybe it's small enough and it's not under Kathleen Kennedy, because she's not very attached to Lucasfilm at the moment. More on that later, we hope. But maybe this thing has a chance to land on some fertile soil and grow. The question, Lauren, is, as you're thinking about this and the time period that it's in, what might be a story they could go with if they're going to do a young indie? Like what could grab the attention of the audience out there in your mind? And if it's too, listen, you just learned that they might be doing this. I've been stuck with this for 2 weeks. By the way, folks, if you're members of the Patreon, I was given permission to give a brief tip about it. But yeah, so Lauren, what do you think? What do you think they might do?
It's tricky for me to tell. I'd actually have to do some research of the time period to come up with something compelling because I don't really know what was going on in 1913 at the time. I do think the age is a little bit tricky. I don't know that I would want to do Indy at 14. I think 20 is a little easier to sink your teeth into.
What if it's one of those he's running away from home and we get the idea of the disenfranchisement of him and his father?
Well, that's in a way kind of what they did in some of those early Young Indiana Jones Chronicles episodes. There was when Sean Patrick Flannery took over, he ended up heading south and getting involved with Pancho Villa down in Mexico. And they reference that in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull as well, briefly, when Indy's talking to Mutt. So, I mean, you could do something like that, but then you'd have to move beyond that 14-year-old time frame. So, I don't know. I really would have to think about it some more to figure out what would be your entry point for a 14-year-old Indy in 1913.
Well, let me speculate on some speculation then, Lauren, because this is something that I've considered. If they went with 14, and I didn't know the ages of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles when those took place, you say 9 and 20.
Mhm.
So I didn't know that before we started talking. If they go into this with him being 14, that does give them the advantage that if it's really successful, they can run with it till he's about 17 without having a problem.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. And you could eventually end up with him heading down to Mexico and getting involved with Pancho Villa. There's also, I mean, this would be later on past that point, but he ends up in Chicago for a while. In fact, there was an episode where Harrison Ford made a brief appearance to bookend the episode. That was Indiana Jones and the Mystery of the Blues, which was kind of fun. So, I mean, there's lots of things that you can do in that period before the movies take off. But I think that the more interesting period is actually in the 20s leading up to the 30s, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the Roaring 20s. You know, you have, when you're still in kind of the Gilded Age, you have Life's a Party. You've got the mafia taking off in the cities. You have flapper girls and big bands and modern progress. And then you have Prohibition, which creates all kinds of interesting things. And then the stock market crash
But here's the problem, Lauren. Remember what they learned from Solo, a Star Wars movie or Star Wars story? They learned, and this was the wrong lesson, but what they took away from it publicly was we can't recast. If they put someone out there as Indy in the 20s, they run into that problem, and they're terrified of that problem.
I have some sympathy for them with that problem because I think recasting Indy is tough. But I think the bigger problem is, how do you tell an Indy story in the modern day without getting ripped apart by people who are concerned about how things look or sound? A lot of that was driven home in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom because a lot of people were very upset at how the Indian culture was portrayed. And the lesson that they took from that is, well, we've got to go back to the enemies from Raiders because everybody hates them.
Right.
But you run into a danger there because you can't go back to that well all the time. And I think Indy is at its best when you're exploring something new. Now, I think the computer games actually handled this pretty well. In Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, they told a fantastic story that involved a legendary culture that wasn't based on any real culture, although it did deal with the myths of the Minoans and the Greeks. I thought Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, while a lot of people saw that as an inferior story, I loved that one primarily because of the level design and how it really made you feel and think like an archaeologist. Then you had Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb, which dealt with Emperor Qin's pyramid in China. And I thought that was also a lot of fun. I think the computer games, while sometimes they have strayed maybe a little too far into the supernatural, where the movies kind of just dip their toe in it, they go a little bit far, but that's for gameplay reasons. Some of the people that were involved with creating those stories, though, they approached it the right way. And if I was going to give my personal advice, Whoever's behind trying to develop this project, pick up the phone and give a call to Hal Barwood. He's a guy who knows how to do the research and how to craft an original indie story. He gets the flavor right. So that's what I would be doing as one of the creatives.
There you go. All right, Lauren. Well, it's always a wonderful time to get to spend time with you. And Lauren, I've always, for I don't know how long now, said that we had to have you on for a positive video. I hope this is positive. I hope in 3 or 4 years, if this starts to make its moves into becoming real, I hope that we can look back and say, wow, we called it. And wow, it actually looks good still, like we were hoping for. That would be great. People are often saying, you guys just deal with stuff that's terrible. Oh, we feel so sorry for you because Disney's in this bad place. And it's like, yeah, it gets a little tiresome covering, negativity, but that's what they give us. This is a company that's dropped something like 60% of its total value in 3 years. That being Disney. Lauren, it's nice to have a positive, pleasant thing to talk about. And hopefully this will go well. And we hope also in a post Kathleen Kennedy era. Lauren, you've been doing a great job of holding that torch of showing people what good fiction was before we got into the modern era. Can you tell the folks out there what it is you're up to on your YouTube channel?
Yeah, I've been reading Shadows of the Empire lately. This is a story that takes place between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi and involves the rebel characters doing their best to try and rescue Han Solo from Boba Fett. Spoiler, they don't succeed in this story. But it also explores the criminal underworld and introduces a bunch of new characters. It also had Darth Vader in the EU for the first time, if you don't count Splitter of the Mind's Eye. So if you're into the old EU or if you're curious about it, join me over on my channel there. You can find me at Lauren Condor 9030, and I hope you have a good time.
You mentioned that Boba Fett is in that one.
Yes, although he was more featured in the comics. He doesn't really make a personal appearance in the novel. He's more kind of seen from the distance, but if you're interested in that whole story, the comic series featured him pretty heavily.
I only asked this to say, were there any rainbow-colored Vespas?
Absolutely not.
That's the way
Although
it should
there is a pretty good speeder bike chase, though.
Well, that's better than what we got in the show. All right, folks. It's time for you to show us that you appreciate this kind of content. Consider clicking the like button, share, subscribe, click it, stick it to the algorithms. It is the notification bell. Drop a comment down below. And folks, if you wonder about our track record when it comes to scoops such as this, we cannot guarantee, as Justin Wilson used to say, we cannot guarantee that this will come to be. But go check the track record. Last year, very high score, and that was through an audit in which Lauren was one of the participants judging our accuracy. And Lauren is a very strict judge when it comes to those sorts of things. All right, folks, we hope you're going to have a great weekend. We're coming to you 3 times a day. Thrice is nice right here on the way at the Pro Channel. Until the next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep having fun.
Listen up, my brothers and sisters. You've been listening to fills and those with an agenda to destroy your brain cells for far too long. It's time to change your way of doing things. Hold up. TPP is the place to be. Covering the news, so honestly, it's a team that's cool and tried and true. Ahead of the culture curve, they're trying to keep you. Jonas and Pro, they run the show, and they dragged in the bearded culture casino. You got Valiant and Lord and Fourth of Light. Wonderful people, yeah, they're alright. They got weird bringing in people like Floral, but made no mistake with Lorena Creole. Amelia and John, stuttering guitarist. Martin and Tawny and someone called CMS. Fat Steven makes a bunch of all the graphics. Did I mention a partnership with Bending in the comics? Fat Sky is a guy and Doc Matt does the web stuff. There's probably some people I missed. I hope they're not telling you the news. That should be fun. With accurate info that's not been spun. You can figure it out as you will see. The TPP is the place to be.
Yeah, Wilton. That was actually pretty good, or White. But I think you might have forgotten Vash.
Well, he lost all his friends. But it was implied.